will you please welcome the Chief Technical Advisor from Splunk, the people who provided us with the T-shirt just a short time ago. Please welcome Mr. Mark Woods.
So it's 6:27 p.m. in the evening, and a team of 92 engineers, experts, and designers are in full-throated celebration. They've just come through 9 months of incredible toil to both stabilize and upgrade a core system, but also to launch a customer-facing offer for the first time in a long time. They've managed to ace design cancel, they've built in contingencies on top of tolerances, and we're really happy with the DevOps implementation that's in place. You've all probably been there, you've had that awesome team that have just absolutely smashed it. But for me, 12 years ago, it took exactly 27 minutes for me to start to worry. We had in place our failure modes, we'd built in network contingencies, we had a robust assurance process in place. And yet, I was left thinking, do I actually understand how resilient my services and products are in place? This is just one of 5 things that I have to balance on a day-to-day basis. Now, the months rolled on, and everything was fine. The system was in place, and we were achieving some great results. And my team even pandered to an overly fastidious boss and actually gave me some scenario planning frameworks for me to start building towards that understanding. But that feeling never really left me. And for every change, for every crisis, for every new innovation, I put in place sometimes to experiment and to start building out that understanding of what measuring that resilience actually was. And it was that actually led me to Splunk 5 years ago. And that's what we'll be focused on today. We'll be focused on looking into those areas and actually trying to cram probably about a decade of experimentation into 20 minutes, I think. So in order to summarize that down, I'll be focused on 4 areas. And we'll be going through these and looking at actual frameworks that we can start to think about. And I was delighted that the panel started to highlight on a few of these. So maybe we can bring that back to something that's more practical that we can actually measure. But before we start any of this, I think there's already been a few presentations and a few panels today that talk about resilience. And yet, with all of that, we haven't actually defined what we're talking about. And it's incredibly important if we're going to talk about measuring something, if we're going to talk about the importance of something, shouldn't we actually be able to say whether we've got it, whether we've got more of it or less of it? And that really comes down to that measurement. But before we start with those, I'm going to avoid in this place actually having a tick sheet definition of this. For all of you in your own individual areas, in your own individual verticals, and in your own individual functions, there will be things you absolutely have to do. And whilst these can contribute towards it, that's not what I'm going to be talking about today. I'm going to use another few analogies, and one of those is within Formula One. Whilst I enjoy the engineering of Formula One, and maybe not necessarily so much the racing, it is a really useful analogy to use when we think about resilience. In the scenario I was talking to you about with my product teams, it was like being on that starting line. If you think of these things, of all those cars lined up, waiting for the lights to light up and then go out, they really have got to the point where they've measured something about the car to make sure they're ready to put it onto the grid. But does that mean that those cars are resilient? What about when you're halfway through? When you're at that point, when you're at the point with lots of the panels we've been talking about today, where maybe crisis has happened, or actually you're starting to get to the point where really on a day-to-day basis, there's so much more you're having to do. What about at the end of the race, where you see that checkered flag? Surely that car coming over the line there is resilient. It's met its goals. It's resilient enough to finish the race. But what if that car's coming in last place, and has for the last few races? Whilst Formula One can be incredibly simplistic against some of the scenarios that we're all having when it comes to the industries that we work in, because there's a clearly defined season, there's a number of races, each one of those races has a defined number of laps, and you can only pit once. If you think of those scenarios going through, it's not just about finishing the race, but where you do, and also not just at the starting line or the finish line. So when we define resilience, there are plenty of institutions that have different definitions for functional areas, but I'll start broad. Often when we talk about resilience, we think about that recovery. When something happens, can I respond? But part of that resilience is also absorption. If I can respond, like I used to do within a network space or in telcos, by not having to change anything, but absorb that change, then surely I have resilience. An incident can happen and I can absorb that, and I don't necessarily have to respond. But even if we thought this broadly, when we talk about it in the systems we're looking in place, we'd be looking into specific areas. Either the underlying architecture, the systems, the compute, how those come together in platforms and services, or actually how you're interacting with them. But we've all seen that things are changing, and they're not as simple as at X number of laps over X number of seasons. It's about that fast response or disruptive change. To be able to differentiate between those things that are business as usual and those things that actually need something to change. And that really means we need to start measuring the interconnectivity between these systems. And if you look at that, even on this simplistic diagram, we've started to come to a choose function. We've started to come to this area where actually it's not just the systems themselves, how they come together, how they interact, but all the possible interactions between them. And in this scenario, simply saying just measure anything isn't good enough. What we start to look at is the right capacity. Whenever anyone says, I'll give you comprehensive, full fidelity, end-to-end visibility, it's saying, great, I have an unlimited pot of gold and an unlimited team. So when we're looking at that right capacity, how do we tune that? We heard today about prioritizing, setting those balances between the business and the functions. And that all comes down to what it is we're trying to deliver. And we're able to bring that focus down to everything that we do. It means that we can start to get to that overall definition of having the right capacity for both recovery and absorption for things that cannot be avoided. If we start to try and project forward and think about AI or automated systems, all we're really trying to do most of the time is avoid something. I promised 4 things though, so I'll get back to those because I can see my 20 minutes already starting to tick down. So we heard today from the last panel talking about this connection between leadership and the people that actually have to do something. And when it comes to those measurements of when that absorption and response, it comes down to operational teams. So how do we connect that board to the keyboard? But it comes down to 2 different approaches. If you're in your team and you're trying to develop forward to a resilience strategy, most of the time it looks at what can those teams understand and respond to themselves. Not having to ask anybody else, being able to do it themselves. Plenty of different initiatives in empowerment and enablement come in this area. But most boards are actually focused on capturing and spotting new opportunities for the business. Building the way that you're looking at then, in order to be able to respond themselves, we need to understand what's significant. Significance in teams, especially when it comes into cyber or into infrastructure operations, typically builds bottom up. What is critical from a component level or what is critical from a system level? Going back to our first definition, that would only address the first part of what can I absorb or respond to. For the business, we're looking at, well, how much change can we consume? And it often comes down to what questions you're asking before you even sign off that change. So building and trying to bridge this gap, the next thing we need to think about is that health. Call it performance, call it health of the overall operations, not just that individual function. I mean, you can start to bridge that gap to a risk profile that isn't just a count of incidents. But we can't just do that with 2 lines in isolation. We talked about measuring and bridging those gaps. When it comes to that overall definition, the definition I gave you was about operational resilience. But if we think about each one of our individual teams, what we're really talking about is functional resilience. The area of a team that's contained within itself that can change how it's operating. For the organization, organizational resilience comes in, and there's plenty of external factors that affect this. Operational resilience is really how you start to pull some of those functions together to work across teams, but really making sure that we're taking into account some of the operational imperatives. If we were to keep this at that simple level, we could look across at the different stakeholders that are actually trying to drive this forward. And it's not just the CISO. It's multiple technical stakeholders and non-technical stakeholders across the board. But the articulation of what they're trying to do, whilst it has an outcome, whilst they're able to articulate not being able to see that disruption, putting constraints in areas, expecting the unexpected, that doesn't actually help us to measure what we're trying to drive forward. It doesn't help us to look at whether we've improved or not. That operational resilience is a way to group some of those areas together to make sure you have something tangible to actually measure. Whilst it takes some attributes from the overall operational and organizational system, ecosystem, people resilience, it really is focused on how do you bring together those functions. And if we zoom right in, what it means is that you're talking about a service context rather than just operational resilience. And that means that you can think about these things to start off with in terms of critical services. Most of the time, there'll be no debate from a board to say, these are my small group of critical services that I really want to start this with. But unless you're able to focus this both on customer-facing products and new initiatives, all you'll have is a split demographic between those critical things that have to stay the same and newer things that are changing. So if we think about the second thing, we're starting to understand here how 2 things need to come together, and I often like to call this the ambidextrous delivery. Making sure that actually it's one thing coming together to deliver and not 2 people, one with a left hand and one with a right hand, trying to feed themselves. Because there is complexity in our systems. And we've also seen from presentations today when we have to dive down into those levels of complexity, and when really we should be abstracting away from them. If we're to simplify down into what you're measuring traditionally in resilience, it comes down to 2 things. What capacity do I have to see things across everything? And what capabilities do I have to be able to interpret that? If we go back to that focus on the services and products that you've prioritized, what you're starting to do is have that measure. If I have capacity to be able to absorb, do I need the capability to be able to respond? But if we just stop there, we really would be building from a function upwards or from systems upwards. We've talked about being able to respond to actually what users, be they internal or external, require. And that means understanding that, but in a context of where the impact actually flows. And if we're able to bring that together, then we have a way of starting to prioritize. We can look at performance in terms of what we're actually delivering, and then try and stitch that back together in terms of those key impact areas. When you hear things like a key risk indicator, is that a risk to our capability and capacity? Or actually is that a risk in terms of the performance we have for end users, really starting to clarify in terms of the impact it will have? Because that's what allows us to then start balancing this ambidextrous delivery. Is what we're doing just risk mitigation? Is it just opportunity exploitation? In most cases towards building resilience, it has to be both. And that means a further definition. If we look at that operational resilience, it needs a team behind it. We've heard today from multiple different stakeholders talking about it's not just technology. But that measurement is not just a measurement of technology, it's a measurement of the organization and the operation itself. But if we take the other side of that, the exploitation of some of those opportunities, that means new functionality, new service models, and more change. If we then start to think about this, this is where agility comes in. This is how we're starting to try and balance most businesses, especially when we're driving towards resilience. And it means having to balance both that recovery and absorption with moving quickly to anticipate and take advantage of opportunities to maximize change. If I just move fast and break things, I will spend a lot of time trying to rebuild that resilience. If I just build for resilience, putting more and more robustness around the system, I will limit my opportunity for change. And that means that delivery needs to be balanced around that, and we need to be able to measure the outcome of that operational resilience to understand what buffer you have in place to be able to absorb, or what changes need to happen to actually change the fundamental system itself. And that's how we start to build those things together. So I've talked a lot about measurement. There is always this battle of the insight ladder. If you think back to the last time you talked to leadership, you presented to the board, you went to the design council for some extra funding, how many different versions of where the business was or what the organization thought it was were presented? How many different expert opinions were put in place? And I understand, Mark, that your metrics said this, but my metrics say something different. And this is because we have this battle of an insight ladder, because we're really talking about different things that really do start to affect the business in exactly the same way. For performance, very much in our teams is about doing. I need to do, I need to respond, I need to work. And that builds, if we've got great teams, towards that improvement. There's incremental changes that really start to change things. But most of the time in their business, we're looking for those areas of challenge, those opportunities for change, when the system or the market has really changed on us. And most of the time that comes down to justifying the budget, the change in priorities or capacity. When we build this up, this changing motion that carries on constantly putting in place. When we talk about that understanding, it needs to bring those two worlds together. This is not about making sure that everything is shared with everybody and there's only one single version of the truth. But when it comes to balancing that performance with that challenge, it's the understanding of those critical services that counts. And that means we come down to the one ring to rule them all. There is no one ring to rule them all. You'll have seen in these areas that actually these services and the systems and products that you have to put into place are prioritized, and they have distinctive requirements. It means that functionally, while you might have to deal with them differently, there are some concepts that you can start to put into place if we look at that balance between risk mitigation and opportunity exploitation. And that's because as we go through in those areas, you need to be able to close a loop on that insight, to build that understanding outwards and outwards. For most of us in operational areas, that means turning visibility into detections and then a response. But if we just focus on that, we'll become insular in terms of the individual functions themselves and not really be collaborating that context. And while shared tooling and shared data can help, it's really that shared context of how is that helping me the understanding of the service itself. In security, we have a unique opportunity, given that everything we do is based on the understanding and the context of that data. Other functional areas may be able to operate without that intrinsic knowledge of data and the capacity and the detections and the context, but security can't. And that means if you can start to build out that way of thinking into the services and products, there's a unique position for every organization to build that towards that organizational resilience stance. So if we think about this and summarize it down, we're trying really within that area of data and particularly context to drive understanding. And that understanding needs to be focused on a service or product. Talking about 1,000 of something yesterday to get to 900 of it tomorrow, whilst it will improve some areas in function, is not going to improve our overall resilience. Because what we're talking about when it comes to balancing that delivery is impact. The impact of something happening, but realistically the impact on that end customer or user. And that means for a board and balancing that delivery, balancing risk and articulating it, but really starting to talk about that capacity for change. Thank you very much.